Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Friday, May 9th, 2025, episode 383, and we're going to talk about this idea of following your passion. It came to me only because I attended a commencement ceremony today. Yes, one of my kids finished college. It was for the College of Science and Technology, something I think which didn't really exist when I was younger, but now it seems like several colleges have something like that. Um, and because it is very technology oriented, science and tech, it seems like a lot of the graduates have plans. They know exactly what they're going to be doing upon graduation, which was really interesting because normally I go to the College of Liberal Arts graduation, and you just know that a lot of those graduates have no job prospects. Just simply because their majors and the things that they studied and the things that they did in college does not lead to a specific occupation. A lot of the students in CLA will go on to grad school to further research obscure ideas and topics, which again doesn't have necessarily specific job skills. Although just being a college graduate, I suppose, does make you better qualified for certain jobs. But then again, there are other factors, and those are the ideas I wanted to talk about today. So there's this idea of following your passion. So figure out what your passion is and then follow it. And I remember hearing this when I was younger, and a lot of my friends would be like, I have no idea what my passion is. And that's not surprising. A lot of young people, because of the way society is, on the one hand, there's so much information, and on the other hand, there's very little breadth. There's very little width in that subjectivity and that perspective. And so, very few of those things will lead to passion, right? Like that's all obsession, perhaps. A couple steps short of obsession would be passion. At least that's the way I try to understand it. And then, so you have speeches by people, successful people, famous people who'll say, follow your passion. That's what I did. And I thought about it. I always heard that and I said, huh, okay. And I knew there was something off about it, but I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to say. And, I didn't really care to at the moment. So I never did until now. Um, but the interesting thing is that these people who are giving graduation speech or motivational speeches and they say, follow your passion, well, they were invited because they are successful. And a lot of successful people will tell you they followed their passion. But how many people followed their passion and failed? Something that we don't know. In other words, 100% of successful people follow their passion, right? I mean, you could do something like that, but they're successful. And so one might say it's sort of self-justification. So how many people heard that speech when they were young and said, I'm going to be an actor, but and failed, ended up working at a restaurant as a waiter for years or decades. Perhaps some people who go to school, they choose a major where maybe the GPA isn't all that important, but maybe it's performance of some kind. Well, upon graduation, how many options do you have? Having a lower GPA, being a very, very specific major, which doesn't have a lot of flexibility in it, in a job market, in a job field where the competition is extremely tough, extremely tight. Um, how many options do you have? Now, it is, I think, common that a lot of people will continue to pursue a passion for too long. In other words, they held on too long to the dream and they left themselves with very few options. So I always ask people to consider how employable is that passion? I mean, yeah, you may be all gung ho about it, but can you get a job with that passion? Is there something related to it where you can find employment and apply your skills? How much does it pay? Who gets paid? Uh, can one support a family with it? So there might even be a major in college, a concentration, a field of study, which is your passion. But then how many jobs are there available for that specific major, that specific field? This is not the same as an independent thinker. Sometimes a child is natural. They know and they follow their visions. Somehow they inherently know and they gravitate to certain fields over others. They may look at a machine and kind of know how it works or is curious to figure out how it works. Systems, ecosystems, biosystems, computer systems, systems of nature or business. They kind of have a grasp of those things better than other people. And then there are those who have ideas, ideas which lead to innovation and creativity. But then again, those independent thinkers are very much like what a business school would say is an entrepreneur, has a business idea and then pursues it to try to make it happen. But we know that not all independent thinkers are successful because what are they thinking about independently? Is it something that other people could relate to? Especially, does your idea convert into a product or a business model that will result in financial gain for yourself? Because a lot of ideas, as creative as they might be, do not translate into a job, does not translate into a business. And so there's that risk. So there are many independent thinkers, many ideas that they come up with. Not all of them are viable. Not all of them will result in a comfortable way of life. And so I was thinking of that kind of idea of follow your passion. And thankfully, I don't hear it as much, although I am sure people still say it. In other words, the person who's giving you the speech and telling you should follow your passion, well, they're probably more the exception than the rule. Many people will try to follow their passion and they will crash and burn. I knew this one kid, this was a long time ago. I asked him what he was planning on doing. He said he was going to be a professional football player. And I kind of looked at him and he definitely was not going to be a professional football player. And I asked him why he kept saying that. And he said, well, because I'm following my passion. Unfortunately, he couldn't read very well. He really didn't, yeah, he didn't do very well in school. And I asked him if he played in high school, and he said no. And that's what was, I think, probably the worst case scenario, where someone who hears that speech of following one's passion and he says, yeah, I really love football, so I'm going to follow my passion. But there's just simply no way he's going to be able to fulfill that dream. And so you need more than just simply a passion, right? You need exposure to as many different ideas as possible because you might not realize that your true passion is somewhere else. So then I started thinking about parental involvement. When you go to a graduation ceremony, a lot of parents and family, they show up to celebrate this happy occasion with the student, with the graduate. Now, how involved are parents? And in the North American setting, well, it's a big question, right? Are both parents in the picture? Is it a single parent? What's the gender of the parents or a single parent? I remember when I was in school, when I was in elementary school and high school, even in college, uh, I would see people who seemed to know exactly what their next move was, what they needed to do to set up their next step. They always seemed to be ahead of the game. Like it seemed like they had access to all this information that I didn't have. And so I was always behind. I was always doing things wrong. I always had missteps, and I just couldn't figure out where they were getting their information. We were in the same class together, but how do they know what to do? But I did not. And I remember when I was really young, we would do these school projects. And when we get to school, my project, honestly, I gotta tell you, some of them I just ripped up and pretended that I never did it because I looked at everyone else's projects and they were incredible. Just, and I was so embarrassed that I would smash whatever it is that I brought because I couldn't put it next to what other people had done. And I was just so amazed. I was like, wow, these people are so talented. I'm nothing compared to them. And so I was just so embarrassed that I just flunked the assignment. Well, after I got married and started having kids and they got older, they went to school and they had projects. Well, my wife never got help from her parents for anything. And she was always upset about that. She always, uh, you know, that really was something that was hanging over her head for a very long time. Now, to be fair, her parents were too busy working like 12, 14 hours a day so that she could have a better life than they did. It's a common story among people who immigrate to America. I think her father was working at an engineering place and then, but he needed more money. And so he quit, opened up a business and started making a lot more money, but it requires lots of hours out of the home. And so, my wife never, rarely saw her parents. And so they certainly weren't going to help her with her school projects. And so she made a point to help out all of our kids with everything. And judging by the stories that my kids would tell me when they came home, it suddenly dawned on me that most of those kids that I knew back in the day, their parents helped them. That's why their projects were so good. And then I slowly realized, oh, that's why all these other people seem to be one step ahead of me, 10 steps ahead. They were getting help from their parents. They were getting advice, guidance from people who loved them. And that help is so important. Now, on the flip side of things, my parents never really helped me either. It was sink or swim every day. And of course, it was trial and error for me. Both of my parents were college educated, but they were educated in Korea, and the rules are all different. There, everyone follows the same pattern. You don't really need to think. You just follow, memorize, do what you're told, and then that's it. You do what you're told well, and you're a top student. And so that was their sort of, and don't get me wrong, both my parents were super, super smart. Uh, you know, but they just didn't know how to raise me, right? Especially in this country where there's very little guidance when it comes to certain things. So, the sudden realization of the role of parents, what are parents supposed to do? Um, Now, some parents go overboard in terms of not doing it in a way that is accepted by the student, or perhaps the help is in an area and for things which the child doesn't really care about. And so that's when you get into the, accusations of parental projection, right? They're trying to live their life through their child. You see that accusation, whether it's true or not, is remains to, be analyzed. Or another question is the parent nurturing the student or nudging and trying to get the student to try a field which they're not really suited for, right? So are parents trying to facilitate or encourage and help students according to the talents of their students, according to the abilities of their children, right? So none of my kids were going to be an athlete, for example. One thought about it, but then as soon as he stepped on a college campus, he was like, "Yeah, there's no way I can compete against these people. There's just so much bigger, faster, stronger." And so, we as parents, we're constantly trying to bounce ideas off of him so he can, if he does want to continue in athletics at a Division I school, then he has to think of something alternate, right? Something that's athletic, perhaps a club sport, something where it's more of a not a very well-known popular sport, but something where a little bit of athleticism can help you go a long way, like fencing. Now, Asian families in general, there are a lot of other dynamics, right? Coming to America really messes up a lot of those Asian families. But when the Asian community is quite large here, you can almost simulate a kind of culture atmosphere that is very similar to what they had in an older country. Indians, for example, Asian Indians. There's so many here in the United States that they actually create that kind of community where they are able to communicate and maintain, and therefore the kids understand the mentality which their parents have, something which I never had, right? But how well they can communicate their values, their study ethics, and the vision for life becomes really important. And so not all Asian families are the same, obviously. With in the Indian families, because there's so many, they can relate to each other. I didn't have that. There weren't, when I was growing up, there were no uh, Koreans who were born in the United States. They just didn't exist. And those that had been born in America, they weren't living in my city. They were living more on the West Coast, from the 1800s. But Asian families in general, one has to try to figure out how long ago they came from Asia, because the more recent and then there's a breaking point, right? Because then it's hard to learn English and do well in school. But there are some people who are accustomed to a much higher pace of learning and competition, right? And so when they come here, everything seems to be in slow motion, and no one seems to put a priority on getting high grades. And so a lot of Asians, starting from the 70s, found it really, really easy to be successful in schools here in America. And it's not even that they were among the smartest in Korea. It's the fact that everything is so easy here, right? So SAT tests are given to seventh graders in Korea, and they all get perfect scores. Even on the English, you see, because it's that rigorous over there. And, they're taking this, some of the kids in seventh grade, they take the test and they're like, is this some kind of joke? This is their college entrance exam? No way. And then you look at their college entrance exams, right? And it's just so mind-boggling hard. Um, so 30 years ago when I was in Korea, competition was fierce. If you were a senior in high school, man, no one ever saw you day and night, except for when you're sleeping and going to the bathroom or even maybe cleaning up. you were studying, right? There was no way you couldn't study. And some Americans might think that's kind of weird until you realize that the college entrance exam in Korea at the time, 30 years ago, had 21 subjects on the test. 21. I can't even think of 21 subjects, but they were tested on 21 subjects. I knew a person who deliberately failed the ethics test, right? And was rejected from the university that she was applying to. In other words, you're only allowed to apply to one university once per year, right? You got one shot and that's it. And obviously, a lot of people don't make it. And so they have to wait another full year, another year of studying before they can take the test again and see if they got in, right? I don't know if the rules are the same, but that's the way it used to be for a very, very long time. You can only apply to one school per year. And so you had some guys who really wanted to go into a certain school. It's their fifth year, their fifth time that they're trying to get into that school. And the reason is because it will make or break your life. It will make or break your chances of getting married, of getting a job, etc. Everything hangs on what school you go to. And so it's worth waiting 5 years to go. But think of all the waste of manpower, time, etc. So you go from a country that that's the norm, and then you come to America where you can apply to as many colleges as you want, and someone will is bound to accept you, is it right? So all of these different things that makes it look like there's a higher success rate, but there are people who don't, the things don't work out that way. And so the perception is, why are a lot of Asians driven as much as they are? Is it the success, the desire for success? Is it the desire to please their parents? Or is there a natural ability among a lot of Asians just because the society has been structured that way for like at least 1,000, 2,000 years? Um, is it that many people have this ability to memorize and take tests really, really well because that's all those societies ever did is force people to memorize and then take tests. So it might be that certain skills become more like people select according to those skills, because of the way marriage rules work as well. So coming back to America, what's the problem? What's the phenomena facing graduates? Well, there's a stigma against pursuing wealth, right? And so there's certain jobs are better than other jobs, but there doesn't really need to be, right? As I've discussed before, greed is just simply the desire to want more than what you have now, which makes all of us greedy. And so, aside from the pejorative use of the word greed, there's no new information, right? So, when someone uses the word greed, you're just labeling that person as bad, but there's no new information, right? That the only thing I know is that person makes more than the person who called them greedy. That's the only thing you know and can learn from the use of that word, right? And so, why is it that way? Why is it so difficult for people to figure out what to do after graduation? And it's because society has been contaminated with government funding. You might be rolling your eyes at this point, but it's true. Government funding is everywhere. And that is clearly evident by the withholding of billions of dollars from prestigious Ivy League universities, right? Because they're not doing the government's bidding. They are not doing as ordered. And so their federal money is withheld, right? But then you realize that was the purpose in the first place, to give these universities money so that now they have to do what they are told to do. And then when they don't do it, then the money dries up. Right. It's basically the bribery, extortion, how do you want to call it? But it is not a good thing. At least more people know now that a lot of the money that universities have to do research comes from the government. And so That ability to control the funding that dictates what is studied, how it is studied, right? And so if you want to continue to study DEI topics, then you'll get all the funding that you want. But if you want to study freedom market dynamics, yeah, there's no money for you, right? And so it's because the government controls, the money that universities get. They get to dictate what is studied, what is pursued. And when you go into the world of science, then you will probably be horrified at the way the government is spending the money, right? So a large part of it, for example, went to gain of function research in Ukraine and China, not for not for looking for a cure to cancer, right? And so that's the problem with government funding. It just derails, misallocates research. Many jobs are government funded jobs. And so people have to follow the incentives and ideas of the state, not your own ideas, right? Your ideas are not those which are funded. So how are you going to be able to follow your passion only if it is in line with a government agenda? That's the only way you're going to get public money for that. And then wait till the military draft kicks in, and then all of us are going to be given a job, right? And that is not something to look forward to. In fact, that is going to be a horrible thing. Uh, and this is all because of the Federal Reserve. I talked about it before, the debt-based economy. A lot of jobs and careers which used to exist here in America are no longer here. And so your passion might have been a job that is no longer here. Uh, you know, but if your job is your passion, you are one of the few who get to say that, then you basically hit the lottery, right? Because it is extremely rare, as are many other things. But of course, you always can find a speaker who will say, follow your passion. But it really is not the best advice you can give to someone. Although it sounds good, a lot of people like it and they want to hear it, but it really isn't a good piece of advice. And so what I've told everyone that I ever meet, and especially my kids, you can follow your passion, but you got to ask yourself, can you use that to put food on the table? Can you support a family? Are you going to be able to live well if with that passion of yours? Uh, and so I've told my one child who's really into music, but I told him, you're not going to make any money. And so therefore, what you should do is find a job and use that job to fund your passion, and then you can go from there. Um, it doesn't help that politicians create uncertainty with their random tweets or posts, and the fact that they don't consider or think how their irresponsible words, off the cuff remarks shake the global economy. It kind of is really upsetting every time you see it. Um, and it doesn't help with all of the regulations and the tariffs and the saber rattling, all of the stuff that's going on. It creates uncertainty. And since we know that a lot of countries are pulling out of America, they're pulling their investments out of America, it's going to get worse. But all of that is because of the Federal Reserve government uh, and their gutting of the job market, their uh, squashing of the entrepreneurial spirit here in the United States. So hopefully, soon we can have that back, and then you'll have more college graduates being looking ahead and being filled with joy for the things that they will be able to do in their near future instead of trying to figure out what their next step might be. That's it for this episode. I went a little bit too long, but I'll talk to you next time.